He thought it was just an ordinary garbage bag. But when it fell during loading and tore open, the garbage worker froze in terror. What spilled onto the ground was so shocking that he immediately dialed 911. Subscribe to the channel and comment which country you're watching from. The alarm clock rang before the sun had even begun to chase away the lingering night. Tyler Johnson's hand, calloused from years of lifting bins and dragging containers, slammed down on it with the tired precision of habit. He lay there for a moment, eyes open to the dark room, listening to the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchenette and the faint rumble of a truck passing on the distant highway. Another day, another route, another load of trash the city didn't want to see. He pushed himself up, joints complaining, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the boots on the floor as if they were the ones dragging him out of sleep. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't the sort of job a child dreamed about. But it was honest, and it paid the bills, and sometimes that was all that mattered. His routine was familiar to the point of muscle memory. A quick shower to wash away whatever sleep had clung too tightly. A breakfast that barely qualified as such, a piece of toast and a lukewarm mug of instant coffee. He put on his uniform, dark green with reflective stripes, the fabric faintly smelling of diesel and disinfectant even after the wash. The name patch on his chest said Tyler in bold white letters. To most people in the city, that's all he was. One of the guys who made their trash disappear before they even woke up. Before leaving the apartment, he paused for a moment at the window. The city looked almost peaceful at this hour. Street lights flickering softly over empty sidewalks, warehouses and factories reduced to silent silhouettes against a deep indigo sky. But there was a hollowness here too. Factories shuttered, storefronts boarded up. The old industrial district that once thrummed with life now existed mostly as a husk, a place where the wind carried dust instead of ambition. People didn't come here anymore unless they had to. Tyler always had to. The drive to the depot took 15 minutes, down cracked streets lined with graffiti-tagged walls and chain-link fences that protected nothing but decay. He parked in the lot and walked inside, nodding silently to the few co-workers he passed. There wasn't much conversation this early. The break room smelled of reheated food and industrial-strength coffee that tasted like metal no matter how much cream you drowned it in. Tyler didn't stop. He never lingered. He preferred to get moving before any fatigue had a chance to settle deeper into his bones. Outside, the line of garbage trucks loomed like beasts waiting to be awakened. His truck wasn't new, but it was his, assigned to him officially 2 years ago and familiar in every creak and rattle. He did the usual checks: hydraulic lines, compactor controls, lights, fuel level. He ran a hand across the chipped paint on the side panel and felt the cold steel beneath. There was comfort in knowing exactly how much you could rely on a machine. Trucks didn't lie. They didn't hide their failures behind false smiles. When something was wrong, they told you in smoke, in grinding gears, in alarms. Humans were never that honest. Tyler climbed into the cab, started the engine, and listened to it roar awake with a deep vibration that traveled through the seat and into his chest. He entered his route on the electronic log and pulled out of the depot right as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of morning. The route today started in the industrial zone on the northeast side of town, past rows of warehouses that looked like they'd been abandoned by progress. Many of them had been. The city planners pretended they had a redesign project waiting just around the corner, but everyone knew money didn't flow to places like this. He made his first few stops with the efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times before. Containers rolled, the hydraulics lifted, trash poured into the hopper with the familiar crumple and cascade of unwanted remnants of life. Cardboard, plastic, rotten food sealed in tied bags, old clothes stuffed away like memories no one wanted anymore. In this work, you saw a different version of the city's truth. People threw away more than trash. They threw away guilt, secrets, parts of themselves they hoped no one would ever find. As the truck rolled deeper into the district, the buildings grew older and rougher. Many looked empty, windows blackened or boarded up. Graffiti names and symbols marked territory for people who appeared only at night. Tyler slowed near a large brick warehouse that had once been a shipping hub. He remembered stories from older workers, trucks lined up at all hours, conveyor belts rattling non-stop. But that was before the fire. Before the scandal. Before the company closed its gates and left the building to rot like a corpse no one wanted to claim. The container stationed there was always fuller than it should have been. Someone was using the warehouse for storage or dumping despite the locked doors and warning signs. Tyler approached it with the grabber, eyes scanning the area out of habit. No people, no movement. Just the cold morning air and the distant hum of traffic from the freeway. He lifted the container and tipped it toward the hopper. Bags slid out, tumbling into the compacting chamber. All but one. One bag snagged. A large black plastic bag, industrial grade, the kind used for construction debris or scrap metal. It bulged oddly, as if whatever lay inside wasn't soft like garbage, but rigid, uneven. Tyler muttered under his breath and maneuvered the lift to shake it loose. The hydraulics strained. The truck jerked, giving a loud metallic shudder. The weight distribution was wrong. He frowned. It was too heavy. He hopped down from the cab and approached the jammed bag. The morning light had grown stronger, enough to show the texture of the plastic. Tough, tightly sealed, clean compared to the scuffed and torn bags around it. Out of place. Suspicious. He reached up with his pike pole, hooked the bag, and yanked. It tore with a sudden, sharp rip that startled him more than it should have. Something fell. Not trash, not scrap. Swaddled shapes, tight bundles wrapped in layers of plastic sheeting and thick tape, hit the pavement with a dull, heavy thud. One of them slid across the ground, the motion loosening the tape just enough for a corner of the wrapping to peel back. Tyler froze. A human hand slipped into view. Not a mannequin. Not a prop or a prank. A real hand. The skin dark, nails cracked, dried blood along the knuckles. A hand that once belonged to someone who had lived and moved and spoken. Tyler's breath caught painfully in his chest. The world seemed to tilt, sound fading into a distant roar. His heart hammered wildly, his mind scrambling to make sense of what lay before him. He staggered back a step, staring at the hand as if it might move, as if this was some grotesque dream, and the corpse would sit up and laugh, and he would wake in his bed again. But the image didn't change. The shapes didn't vanish. They were real, all too real. His stomach clenched, bile rising, but he forced himself to breathe. His fingers twitched with the instinct to fix things, to tidy up and move on. This was trash, after all, and trash got dealt with. But not this. Not today. He backed away, fumbling for the radio clipped to his chest. Words tangled in his throat, yet somehow he managed to report the discovery, his voice sounding strange and distant in his ears. Dispatch told him to secure the area, not to touch anything else, to wait. So he stood there. Alone in the cold stillness of morning, with bodies at his feet and the metallic stench of blood cutting through the crisp air. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The sun rose a little higher, casting a thin, unforgiving light on the scene. Birds called in the distance, unaware of the horror lying just feet away. Tyler rubbed a shaking hand across his face and tried to keep his breathing steady, tried not to look at the hand again, at the lifeless fingers curled slightly as though frozen mid-grasp. Somewhere, deep in his mind, a thought clawed its way forward. Someone had put those bags here with the belief they'd vanish. Garbage trucks made things disappear. Trash was the city's shadow, taken away and forgotten. Whoever did this counted on that. On him. On people like him not paying attention. He heard sirens before he saw the patrol cars. The sound cut through the still morning like a blade. When the vehicles arrived, doors flew open and officers rushed toward him, toward the scattered bundles, their faces darkening with shock and grim understanding. Yellow tape went up, radios crackled, orders barked. Tyler felt himself recede into the background as specialists took over, as cameras flashed and gloved hands carefully examined every inch of the scene. No one questioned whether this was an accident. The precision of the wrapping, the location, the timing, this wasn't panic or impulse. It was methodical, calculated. Tyler watched, silent, trembling just slightly, though he tried to hide it. The day had barely begun, but everything that made sense just hours ago now felt unrecognizable. His job had always been to clean up after the city, to remove what people didn't want to face. Trash told stories no one wanted to read. Sometimes those stories were just about excess or carelessness. But sometimes, like today, they were about evil. He had expected another ordinary shift, a simple day of lifting, hauling, and driving. Instead, he stood in the stillness of a crime scene, feeling the weight of something much larger settling around him. He didn't know who those bodies were. He didn't know who put them there. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity. His life had just collided with the secret the city had desperately tried to throw away. Police lights strobed across the brick walls of the deserted warehouse, painting the early morning in flashes of blue and red that felt too bright for a place that should have remained hidden in shadows. Tyler stood just beyond the yellow tape as more units arrived, their tires crunching over bits of broken asphalt and scattered debris. It was strange how quickly a lonely corner of the city could become crowded once death was involved. Officers moved with purpose, their radios crackling like insects in the air, while detectives in heavy coats surveyed the area with expressions carved from stone. The containers that had spilled from the torn bag lay exactly where they had landed, each bundle a silent accusation against whoever placed them there. Tyler tried to keep his gaze fixed anywhere but on them, but the images kept tugging at his peripheral vision. The hand, lifeless and stiff. The plastic wrap stretched tightly over something far more significant than discarded waste. He hugged his arms around himself in the cool air, rubbing at the chill that clung to him deep beneath his skin. One of the first responders, a tall uniformed officer with a solemn calm about him, approached Tyler. He spoke carefully, guiding him away from the site with a firm, but not unkind hand. Tyler answered their questions in low, steady tones, though his voice wavered at times. They needed details about the route, the container, anything unusual he might have noticed. Tyler supplied what he could: the weight of the bag, the way it jammed the machinery, the fact that the warehouse had been abandoned for years, but still seemed to receive plenty of trash. The officer listened attentively, taking notes, and nodded reassuringly each time Tyler paused to steady his breath. Soon after, a forensic van pulled up, and out came a team dressed in white protective suits, masks, and gloves. They moved like surgeons entering an operating room, each motion deliberate and methodical. Cameras flashed, capturing angles and evidence before anything was touched. The bundled shapes were photographed from every side, each one clearly numbered and documented. Then, finally, one of the forensic specialists knelt by the closest wrap and began to cut through the plastic with small, precise snips of scissors. Tyler forced himself not to turn away. He told himself he needed to see, that it mattered to understand the truth of what he had found. The layers of tape peeled back slowly, and more of the shriveled, cold flesh beneath was revealed. Portions of a torso appeared, skin bruised and discolored, muscles stiffened by death. A few officers shifted uncomfortably. One swallowed hard, trying not to let his reaction show. The air seemed to thicken around them. A harsh, metallic smell rose from the open bundle, mixing with the morning air in a stench that made Tyler's eyes sting. It was different from anything he'd smelled during his years on the job. Trash had odors, some vile, but this was wrong. It was the smell of violence and fear and something stripped of dignity. It clung to his clothes and skin, and he feared it would never fully wash away. On the exposed skin of the corpse, something caught the forensic expert's attention. He leaned in closer, raised a gloved hand carefully to brush away sticking debris, and there it was, an unmistakable mark. A shape burned or branded into the flesh. A symbol that looked too precise, too deliberate to be dismissed as accidental injury. Another specialist joined him, snapping photographs and murmuring observations. The symbols appeared uniform, like codes or labels. It was as if the victims had been categorized, organized, treated like inventory. The implications made Tyler's stomach twist. Nearby, one of the detectives stepped aside to make a phone call, his voice tense but controlled. Every detail was being rushed to the higher-ups. Something about this scene had alarm bells ringing loud enough to echo beyond the crime tape. This wasn't a simple homicide. This was bigger, darker. As the forensic team continued to examine the bodies, Tyler noticed a flicker of movement in one of the warehouse windows overlooking the scene. A shadow shifting, a curtain, or was it sheet metal, trembling slightly before falling still. He blinked and stared harder, but nothing moved again. Maybe it was the wind, but the sensation of being watched burrowed into him, setting his nerves on edge. He inhaled shaky breaths, trying to push away the paranoia. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was near, someone who didn't want to be seen. He told one of the officers about what he thought he saw. The man reported it to the others, but by the time a flashlight beam swept across the windows, there was no sign of life. The officer gave a polite nod as if to acknowledge Tyler's concern, yet the doubt in his eyes was clear enough. Stress does strange things to perception. That's what they would think. But Tyler knew what he felt, and it felt real. Detectives eventually approached him again. One introduced himself as Detective Harris, a man whose age showed in the deep lines around his eyes, but whose posture still carried authority and alertness. Harris thanked Tyler for doing the right thing, for calling it in immediately instead of ignoring the strange bag as someone else might have. He asked about the routine of the route, whether anyone unfamiliar had been seen around this area lately, any graffiti that looked fresh, any signs someone had been sneaking in and out. Tyler told him what he could, about the fresh tire marks he sometimes noticed, the occasional rumble of movement behind warehouse walls that should have been silent, odd smells of chemicals or smoke drifting through the air. Detective Harris scribbled in his notebook, thoughtful. The details seemed to matter. There was something familiar in the way he kept glancing back at the mutilated remains, some recognition he chose not to voice in front of everyone. Hours passed before the investigative team was satisfied with the initial scene. They collected samples. Flecks of dried blood on the truck's hopper, remnants of adhesive on the torn bag, droplets of an unidentified dark liquid on the pavement. Every container that held a piece of a person was lifted and placed gently into body bags, labeled and loaded into the van with all the quiet reverence the moment demanded. They even collected the plastic fragments of the torn trash bag, treating it like a valuable clue. Throughout all of this, Tyler remained at the edge of the circle of activity, an outsider who had unwillingly become a part of something gruesome. His truck was being held for inspection, the compactor disabled for forensic analysis. His shift was over before it really began, replaced by questions and paperwork and a hollow ache in his gut. Eventually, Detective Harris approached him again and informed him that officers would escort him to the station to take an official statement. They wanted a detailed account, every second, every feeling, every instinct that had prompted him to shut down the machinery and check the jam instead of forcing it through. Tyler nodded numbly. Of course he would cooperate. He wanted justice for whoever those people were, for that hand that once reached for something with purpose. Before they left, Tyler's eyes drifted once more to the warehouse. Sunlight was rising higher, revealing the building's cracked facade and shattered windows with startling clarity. The place looked utterly lifeless, yet it felt like the epicenter of something dangerous, something that thrived in forgotten corners of the city. He shivered despite the warming air. They bundled him into the back of a patrol car, not arrested, but also not free to simply walk away. A stark reminder that from this moment on, he was tied to the investigation whether he wanted to be or not. The door clicked shut, and Tyler watched the forensic van pull away, carrying the deadly cargo toward a lab where experts would try to restore some identity to the dismembered parts. He wondered who those people had been, where they came from, whether someone was missing them right now, unaware that the worst had already happened. Detective Harris climbed into the front passenger seat and gave a simple nod to the officer driving. The car eased forward, rolling past the crime tape, past the truck, past the building that stood like a scar in the city's landscape. Tyler stared out the window as they left, caught between the surreal events of the morning and the uncertainty that loomed ahead. He knew, deep down, that he had stumbled upon more than discarded bodies. He had ripped open a secret someone had tried desperately to bury, a secret that didn't want to be uncovered. And somewhere, he was certain, the person responsible now knew his name. The drive to the precinct felt longer than it should have. Buildings passed by outside the window in a blur, but Tyler barely noticed the scenery. His mind was still trapped in that alley behind the warehouse, replaying the moment the bag tore open. The sound of the plastic ripping, the thud of the heavy bundles hitting the ground, the horrible reveal of the hand. It all looped behind his eyes like a film he couldn't turn off. The patrol car's radio murmured static-filled updates on other calls across the city, voices sounding impossibly normal compared to what he had witnessed. Once they arrived, the officers led him inside, where the air smelled faintly of coffee, printer ink, and worn carpet. They brought him to a small interview room, windowless, gray walls, a table bolted to the floor, and 2 metal chairs that screeched just enough when they moved to remind anyone sitting in them that comfort was not part of the plan. They offered him water, which he accepted but hardly drank. His hands trembled slightly as they rested on the table, and every time he blinked he saw the branded flesh again. Detective Harris entered the room with a file tucked under his arm. He was quiet at first, as if giving Tyler a moment to gather himself. Then he sat down, opened the file, and began asking questions, carefully, methodically. Every movement, every sound Tyler remembered near the warehouse mattered now. Ty's voice wavered occasionally, but he forced himself to recount everything in detail. Harris listened with full attention, his pen scratching across the page steadily. When the questioning ended, the detective closed the file slowly and folded his hands together. He told Tyler that he had done the right thing, though those words did nothing to lighten the weight crushing his chest. He wasn't dismissed immediately. They wanted him to rest before letting him go, to sit somewhere quiet while they verified the details he had provided. He spent what felt like an eternity in a dim waiting area, staring at the bland pattern of the carpet, trying not to lose himself in the what-ifs. Eventually, Harris returned and told him they would arrange a ride back home, since his truck was still part of an active investigation. Tyler hesitated before agreeing. The idea of going home should have brought relief, a sanctuary away from flashing lights and cold concrete. Instead, it filled him with unease. He kept seeing that flicker in the warehouse window, the sense of eyes watching him. The ride back was silent. When he finally stepped out near his apartment building, the street looked exactly as he had left it just hours ago. But to Tyler, it felt different, like the world had continued spinning while he was stuck in the worst kind of nightmare. He wondered if any of his neighbors would ever guess what horrors he had seen while they slept peacefully. Probably not. People trusted that the darkness stayed far away from their doorstep, that monsters only hid in the places they avoided. He locked his door behind him and leaned his back against it, exhaling a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The apartment was too quiet. The refrigerator hummed like before, but the steady sound offered no comfort now. He made his way to the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and splashed cold water on his face. When he looked up into the mirror, his reflection stared back, wide-eyed, shaken, different. Something inside him had shifted permanently. He tried to sleep later that afternoon, but the moment he closed his eyes, the images returned. He saw not just the hand, but other shapes that hadn't been fully uncovered, shapes that hinted at further horrors beneath the plastic. He lay awake for hours, listening to the faint sounds of cars and distant barking dogs outside. When the phone rang, he jolted upright, heart pounding like a trapped animal in his chest. His supervisor was on the line, voice strained yet calm. They understood what he'd gone through. He was being granted paid leave until further notice. "Take time to clear your head," the man said. But how could he? How could anyone unsee what he had seen? Night fell, and the darkness brought a strange clarity. The world outside his window was quiet again, the street lamps casting long shadows across the pavement. He moved to the living room and stared out for a long time, restless. Eventually, he found himself scrolling through old local news reports on his phone, stories that had once barely caught his attention. Missing persons, workers who vanished months ago. A few names he didn't recognize, but one made him pause. A man named Elijah Cross. Tyler remembered seeing him once near the closing gates of the old factory 2 or 3 years earlier. The article mentioned the factory fire, the so-called industrial accident that had forced the shutdown of the plant. That closure had helped start the decline of the whole district. It all felt connected, too connected. The next morning, the detective called. Analysis had begun. It would take time to identify the victims through DNA testing, but initial findings strongly suggested homicide. No surprise there. The marks on the skin, they were under investigation. But Harris didn't sound optimistic. Whatever those symbols meant, they weren't random. They weren't harmless. Hours later, as Tyler tried to distract himself with mundane tasks, his phone vibrated with a message telling him the detectives wanted to speak again, this time with updates. He agreed to meet at the station late in the afternoon. He tried to steady his thoughts during the ride back, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to hear. Detective Harris led him into an office this time, more personal and less sterile than the interview room. Files were spread across the desk, photos clipped to them. Harris waited until Tyler sat down before speaking. The forensic team had identified two of the victims, both men, both employees of the closed industrial plant. Both had disappeared without explanation in the months after the fire. And it wasn't just them. Out of the initial remains examined, 3 victims had similar connections to the factory. The branded symbols etched into their skin matched old coding used at the facility for equipment tracking, specifically related to parts owned by a private contractor whose involvement in the plant had been classified during its final years of operation. Classified. The word rang in Tyler's mind like an alarm bell. This wasn't a single deranged killer acting alone. This was organized, systematic, calculated. The detective explained how the fire had been labeled an accident, though whispers had persisted about something more sinister. Lawsuits had been quietly settled, families given compensation and non-disclosure agreements. For years, the truth had been buried under paperwork and silence, until Tyler picked up that bag. A sinking feeling settled deeper inside him. Someone out there had gone through immense effort to make those bodies disappear forever. A garbage route was the safest disposal imaginable. No scrutiny, no trace. Except the plan had gone wrong the moment Tyler stopped to investigate the jam. He had disrupted a machine built on secrecy. After leaving the station, he didn't go home immediately. Instead, he walked to the outskirts of the industrial zone as twilight crept over the city. The closed factory rose ahead like a mausoleum built from rusted metal and regret. Windows shattered, gates chained, weeds growing wild through cracks in the pavement. But the factory wasn't dead. He could feel it. A quiet pulse of menace lingered behind the silence, as if the building itself held on to memories it refused to release. He stood there, staring, breath visible in the cooling air, unease sharpening into something more like dread. He wasn't an investigator. He didn't want to be one. Yet, he felt bound to this now. Those bodies wouldn't have been found if not for him. Those voices wouldn't have a chance of being heard. As he turned to walk home, a car approached slowly from behind. Its headlights glowed too bright, following him longer than any normal driver would. When he glanced over his shoulder, the car continued creeping forward, its tinted windows reflecting only the streetlight glare. Unease prickled up the back of his neck. Then, just as abruptly as it had appeared, the car turned the corner and vanished into the night, leaving Tyler frozen on the sidewalk, pulse hammering. He didn't know who was in that car. But he did know one thing. Whoever had dumped those bodies had not anticipated a single garbage worker changing the ending of their story. And now that he had, they were paying attention to him. They were watching. The branded dead were only the beginning. The next morning arrived without much sleep to accompany it. Tyler lay awake long after the encounter with the car, watching the thin curtains shift in the faint breeze leaking through the window frame. Every sound outside, no matter how small, a passing engine, a dog barking, footsteps crunching gravel, sent his pulse racing. He had never lived his life in fear. He had worked hard, kept his head down, and never crossed anyone powerful enough to notice him. But now attention had found him anyway, sweeping into his life like a harsh spotlight no one would want. By midday, Detective Harris called again. There were more questions that needed answers. They wanted him to help piece together timelines and patterns, details that only someone deeply familiar with the city's arteries could provide. So Tyler dragged himself back to the station, ignoring the fatigue pressing behind his eyes. The city seemed louder than usual as he traveled, horns blaring, engines whining, people chattering, but all of it existed under a thin sheet of tension he could not shake. Inside the precinct, investigators clustered around whiteboards marked with maps and photographs connected by red string. The industrial district was circled several times. Old employee rosters from the factory had been pulled from archives and scanned into databases. Several names were already crossed out with the grim certainty that came with having located their remains. Others remained in limbo, still missing, presumed dead. Detective Harris motioned him over to a spread of files on a desk. There were interviews with the former workers from the plant, most conducted years ago around the time of the fire. Many of the accounts were vague and incomplete, full of evasive answers and nervous gaps in memory. As Tyler skimmed the pages, one theme stood out: mention of areas inside the factory that no one was allowed to question. Restricted labs, sealed corridors, unidentified shipments arriving at odd hours. Even in written form, fear leaked through the ink. The detective explained that attempts to re-interview some of those workers had been less than successful. Many flatly refused to talk. Others claimed not to remember anything beyond simple manufacturing tasks. Those who did speak hesitated with every sentence, eyes shifting to corners as though afraid someone might hear. The entire operation, Harris said, had been covered in shadows long before the fire made ashes of its walls. There were rumors, too, circulating now with renewed life. Illegal testing, unauthorized experiments. Workers selected for medical evaluations who never returned to their stations. And the worst of the whispers, disappearances that predated the fire, all written off as employees who simply abandoned their posts. Tyler felt a cold twist in his stomach as the detective spoke. So many lives had quietly slipped away, unnoticed or ignored. Families still searched for answers they would never find. Lives packed into anonymity like the bodies packed into those plastic bundles. The detectives pressed Tyler with questions about trash collection sites near the factory and throughout the industrial zone. He described every location where he had seen irregular dumping, every container kept fuller than expected, every warehouse that seemed more alive than its abandoned appearance suggested. The more he talked, the more certain he became that someone was using his roots as a disposal pipeline, a perfect system for making human evidence disappear. And he had disrupted it. A thought gnawed at him. If these killers had gone unnoticed for so long, what might they do now that they risked exposure? Harris thanked him again, told him updates were forthcoming, urged him to stay vigilant. But that last instruction struck Tyler as hollow. How was he supposed to stay vigilant against an enemy he couldn't see? It felt like standing in total darkness while something sharp circled just beyond the edge of perception. He returned home with the weight of too many secrets dragging at his heels. His apartment should have been a refuge, but now its silence worked against him. He checked each lock twice. He pulled the curtains closed. He paced. He sat. He paced again. Eventually, he laid down in an attempt at rest, though his body remained poised like a wound-up spring. The knock at his door snapped him back to full alertness. It wasn't a loud knock, just 2 firm taps, but it was enough. Tyler's breath caught. He approached cautiously, every nerve screaming. Through the peephole, he saw nothing. Whoever knocked had already left or didn't want to be seen. He hesitated before opening the door, but something in him knew he needed to. When he stepped outside, the corridor was still and brightly lit by harsh neon overhead. It looked normal, except for one thing. A black industrial trash bag sat perfectly centered on his welcome mat. He stared at it for a long moment, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. His hands curled into fists. The bag was sealed tight, smooth and glossy and heavy enough to slightly sink into the mat beneath. Exactly like the bag from the warehouse. His mouth went dry as he crouched. He did not want to touch it, but he had to know. His fingers trembled as he pinched the knot at the top. The plastic crinkled in a familiar, sickening way. Slowly, he loosened the tie and peeled the opening back. Inside were no bodies. That much he realized instantly. But the contents were no less horrifying. A pair of thick gloves stained with dark, rusty patches. A strip of the same industrial-grade tape used to wrap the victims, and a folded piece of transparent plastic sheeting still slick with a residue that might have once been blood. They were trophies, or warnings, or both. Reminders of what he'd stumbled into. Tyler's heart pounded so furiously he felt dizzy. He shoved the bag closed, his breath ragged. His first instinct was to call the police. But fear stopped him. Whoever placed this here knew where he lived. They had walked right up to his door without hesitation. They had time, silence, confidence. Hours passed in a haze of dread. Tyler could not bring himself to throw the bag back into the hallway, nor could he look at it again. Finally, with a surge of desperation, he forced himself to bag it inside another liner and carry it to his truck bed in the parking lot, locking it in the metal toolbox bolted to the frame. He would tell Harris in the morning. He had to. Yet, he knew. This escalation meant the people behind the killings were aware that he was a problem, and they were done warning him. Sleep refused to come that night. Every creak of the building sounded like footsteps approaching his door. Every brush of wind against the window carried the whisper of danger. Even when exhaustion dragged him down, nightmares jolted him back awake. Nightmares of plastic wrapping tightening around him, of hands marked with symbols reaching out of the dark. Morning did not feel like relief. It felt like another test. When Harris saw the bag, the detective's expression darkened. He ordered protection patrols for Tyler's building, though Tyler suspected they'd never see the ones truly responsible. The killers were careful. They had taken dozens of lives without leaving a trail, and now they were hunting the garbage man who broke their pattern. Despite the fear, Tyler refused to curl inward. He accompanied police to survey the industrial district again. They mapped the most suspicious dumping sites. He pointed out containers he had always assumed were just carelessly full, noticing now the patterns he had missed before. He felt sick at how obvious some of it seemed in hindsight. The killers relied on the trash workers' indifference, or rather their trained blindness. People didn't dig through waste. They collected it, compacted it, buried it under tons of refuse without a second thought. No one asked why a bag weighed too much. No one asked why perfectly wrapped parcels showed up in inconvenient corners. until now. Later, standing beside one of the containers behind another decrepit warehouse, Tyler noticed how spotless the interior walls were compared to the outside. Too clean, like someone regularly disinfected it. A place designed not to leave traces behind. His skin prickled with unease. The truth suddenly felt closer than ever, yet far more dangerous. As he and the detective walked back toward the car, Tyler struggled to find his breath. The feeling of being watched returned, a cold awareness creeping into his spine. He turned his head just slightly, scanning rooftops, windows, alleys. He saw nothing, but he could not shake the certainty that something out there was watching him catalog every detail, storing his actions as part of some larger calculus. That night, back in his apartment, the exhaustion crashed over him again. His eyes ached from tension, his body heavy with adrenaline fatigue, but before the numbness could overwhelm him, realization hit him with terrifying clarity. There would be more bodies unless this operation was stopped. More innocent people disassembled into evidence of a hidden past, more secrets hidden under black plastic, more families left with unanswered prayers. If he backed away now, if he pretended this had nothing to do with him, the killers would keep operating in silence. He had become a problem for them. That made him dangerous to them, and strangely, in a way that defied his fear, it also made him necessary to the investigation. Tyler sat in the quiet dark of his living room, hands clasped tightly together as if he were holding on to the last piece of steady ground left in his life. He closed his eyes briefly, letting one full breath fill his lungs. He was just a garbage man, not a hero, not a detective. But only he had been close enough to see what the city had been blindly stepping over for years, close enough to notice the truth rotting beneath its foundations. The silence of the city was cracking, and someone was willing to kill to keep it quiet. Tyler woke before dawn again, but this time it wasn't the alarm that dragged him from sleep. He had spent the night drifting in and out of nightmares that dissolved into the dimness of his one-bedroom apartment. Each time his eyes closed, he saw the same scene. A black bag ripping open, the hand falling out, fingers stiff and reaching for something that no longer existed. He lay still, listening to the slow tick of the wall clock, waiting for his heart to stop thundering in his chest. Sleep wasn't a refuge anymore. Even the dark corners of his own mind weren't safe. He sat up slowly, reminding himself his body was still his own. His hands were shaken again. He clenched them into fists until the tremors faded. A breath in, a breath out. He couldn't afford fear today, not if he wanted to live long enough to see this through. The station felt different when he arrived, busier, heavier. Officers who used to nod with casual greetings now paused a moment longer when they saw him, their gazes tinged with something that might have been respect or pity. Papers rustled under hurried hands, phones rang without end, and the whiteboard in the conference room had grown more crowded with documents and faces. Faces that were just names on missing person reports days ago. Detective Harris waved him into a briefing already in progress. The air was thick with unease. The team had identified the likely perpetrator, a former security coordinator at the factory named Robert Kavanaugh. He had disappeared after the fire. No forwarding address, no public record of relocation, no employer, no trace. But he was no ghost. His file contained a photo. A man with stern eyes, a face that lacked softness, and a posture that spoke of discipline and rigid routine. There was something unsettling about the steadiness in his expression, the confidence in how he carried himself even in photographs. Tyler listened carefully as the detective explained. Kavanaugh had been in charge of internal control enforcement, essentially the person who ensured no one asked questions they shouldn't. He had authorization to move through the restricted parts of the plant, and before the fire, he was on the payroll of a private contracting firm known only by an acronym, ASR Industries. No public website, no transparent business details. A shell company or something worse, it was impossible to say yet. The victims recovered so far were former employees who had all worked shifts in those forbidden areas, and every one of them had a branded number that matched segments of old production logs. They weren't people to whoever marked them. They were test subjects, units, data. Tyler's hands grew cold as the implications sank in. This was no vigilante seeking revenge solely for moral satisfaction. This was someone continuing a program, maybe even believing he was finishing work that had been interrupted by the fire. The killings weren't random retribution. They were organized, planned. The symbols weren't punishment. They were cataloging. The detective paused to look directly at Tyler, a weight behind his gaze. "He knows about yesterday," Harris said. "This bag left at your home, this wasn't just intimidation, it was communication." Tyler nodded, though his throat felt tight. Communication, a reminder, a warning, a promise. The police believed Kavanaugh expected the investigation to die quietly. But after the discovery behind the warehouse, everything had shifted, one domino pushing the next into motion. Now, evidence was piling faster than the conspiracy could suppress it. Bodies had been hidden, but their stories were clawing back into daylight. That didn't make Tyler feel safe. Harris explained the next step in the investigation. If Kavanaugh was still using Tyler's route as a disposal system, then the trucks were the key. Not the warehouses, not the abandoned lots, the trucks. Those vehicles were the last stop before the landfill miles away, where bodies would disappear forever beneath layers of waste and time. No questions, no inspections, no remains ever found. Kavanaugh likely still had more bodies or evidence waiting to be dumped. And he had already tried once to bury his crimes through Tyler. Now, the only way to catch him would be to convince him that nothing had changed. They needed Tyler back on his route. The idea struck him like an icy plunge. He stared blankly at the detective for a moment, trying to process the sheer madness of what he was hearing. Go back, drive the truck, act like nothing happened. Invite danger into the passenger seat beside him. The thought alone made his lungs tighten. But then he imagined another victim, someone who might still be alive, lying somewhere in a dark room, branded, terrified, waiting for those plastic sheets to suffocate the last breath from their lungs. He imagined families who would never learn what happened to their missing son or daughter if he didn't act. He felt the decision settle in him like a stone. "I'll do it," he said quietly, surprising even himself with the firmness of his voice. Harris didn't smile. It wasn't something to celebrate, but he nodded with gratitude and placed a hand briefly on Tyler's shoulder. They would prepare him. Hidden cameras would be installed on the truck, communications equipment too. A tailing team would monitor every turn, every lift of every container. The truck would essentially become a mobile trap. They spent hours equipping it. Tyler watched technicians slide slim black devices into the metal grooves of the compactor, wired tiny transmitters near the dashboard, affix miniature cameras into the corners of the cab. The truck that had once represented routine and simplicity now represented the razor's edge between life and death. Night approached before they finished, the city slowly dipping into the violet haze of dusk. As he waited outside the precinct for a ride home, Tyler stared at the truck parked in the police lot. It looked the same. Scratched paint, dented panels, layers of dirt accumulated from long days of work. But inside, it was different now. Just like him. He found himself drawn once more to the industrial district before heading home. The factory stood in the dark like a beast that had never died. Windows, black as empty eyes, stared out from the structure. The fence rattled in the wind as if warning him to stay away. Tyler told himself he was only there to reinforce the feeling he needed to remember, that this was real, that people had suffered here, that their pain demanded justice. But perhaps he also wanted the factory to see him. He wasn't backing down. Back at his apartment, Tyler expected fear to strip him of sleep again. Instead, exhaustion pinned him into bed the moment he lay down. The nightmares continued, but he endured them without waking fully, drifting between panic and numbness until morning arrived. The call came before the sun rose. The operation was scheduled. His truck was ready. Officers would follow from an unmarked distance. They believed Kavanaugh might make his move today. There was no time left for hesitation. Tyler dressed slowly, the weight of what he was about to do pressing with silent insistence over each movement. He paused at the door, his hand hovering over the knob. For a split second, he allowed himself to imagine stepping back, refusing, letting the police handle it. He could lock the door, crawl back into bed, pretend none of this was his responsibility. But innocent people had already died because everyone else ignored the signs. He stepped outside. At the depot, the usual pre-shift chatter of workers echoed faintly through the garage. Men laughed, cursed about early mornings, sipped burned coffee without complaint. They had no idea what hid inside their city's trash cans, no idea what secrets they compacted every day. Tyler envied their ignorance, though he would not trade places. Not now. His truck rumbled awake beneath him, a familiar vibration that steadied his nerves in a strange way. Routine could be a weapon if he used it right. The radio crackled with prearranged codes disguised as standard instructions. The sky was just beginning to lighten as he pulled out, his pulse steadying with the beat of the engine. The first leg of the route was normal. Too normal. He tried to ignore the paranoia clawing at his senses. He forced himself to breathe through the tension. His eyes flicked to the mirrors constantly, searching for the tail car, never fully seeing it, but always trusting it was there. At the third stop, a container was positioned just a bit too neatly. The area looked undisturbed, but Tyler felt his chest tighten. This could be it. Or maybe not. He had to treat each moment the same. But when he lifted the container, trash spilled into the hopper in a rush. Nothing unusual, just waste, just garbage. The next stop was another warehouse. The container was heavier this time, much heavier. He heard the hydraulics strain and groan with the weight. His breath caught. He couldn't panic. He couldn't stop. The truck lurched as he engaged the lift. The bin rose. The mechanism jerked violently. Something inside was stuck. The compactor jammed, exactly like before. Tyler's heart hammered against his ribs, but outwardly, he did what he always did. He cut the hydraulics. He grabbed the pike pole. He stepped down from the cab. The alley smelled of rust and old rain. Shadows pooled on both sides. He approached the container, every muscle tensing for what came next. Through the tear already forming in one of the industrial-grade bags, he saw edges of hard shapes beneath the plastic wrap. He whispered silently to himself, "Stay calm, stay alive." He reached out. Behind him, something shifted, barely audible, a scrape of shoe against grit. His pulse roared so loudly he nearly missed it. He didn't turn, not yet. He kept his posture neutral, his motion steady, as if nothing was wrong. But the cold air tasted of danger now. The silence grew thicker. He felt eyes on his back. He felt the moment closing like jaws around him. He had stepped willingly into the killer's world. And there was no turning back. For a moment, Tyler couldn't tell whether the sound behind him was real or imagined, just another echo of fear bouncing off the warehouse walls. But instinct told him this was no ghost of his imagination. His fingers tightened around the pike pole, knuckles whitening, pulse thundering loud enough that he wondered if whoever was behind him could hear it too. He tried to stay still, willing his breath to remain calm, to appear as if he were merely a garbage man annoyed at yet another jammed mechanism rather than the unwilling bait in a trap set for a killer. He didn't turn right away. Instead, he reached up as though to adjust the bag stuck on the hook, giving himself a chance to scan his surroundings from the corner of his eye. The alley seemed empty at first glance, but Tyler had never been more aware of how many places a person could hide in plain sight. The corners dipped into shadows thick enough to swallow someone whole. The rusted metal door behind him was slightly ajar, its hinges creaking softly each time the wind nudged it. A flight of exterior stairs climbed along the side of the warehouse, leading up into darkness. Every detail seemed poised to reveal something terrible. Then he saw it. A figure shifting just enough that the motion sliced through the still scene like a blade. A boot scraping against gravel, the faint silhouette of a person slipping from one patch of shade to another. Someone was definitely there, and they were not backing away. They were watching him. Tyler forced himself not to react. He shifted the pike pole as if preparing to pry the bag free again. His mind raced through the protocol Detective Harris had explained. Maintain routine. Do nothing to spook the suspect. The police tail was close enough to intervene in seconds if things escalated. He just had to keep calm long enough for them to act. The bag tore suddenly under the metal hook and sagged open. Tyler flinched before he could stop himself. The contents slumped forward, a mass of tightly bound plastic sheeting and duct tape, unmistakably shaped like a human torso. A sickening déjà vu pressed into his chest as the memory of the first discovery surged back with brutal clarity. And beneath the plastic, just barely visible, the faint imprint of a symbol charred into the skin. Another branded victim, another unfinished secret. Tyler backed away slowly. He no longer cared about keeping up the act. The truth of what lay inside that packaging was more than enough to set the trap, but the killer wasn't running. With a sharp clatter, a metal object hit the ground behind him. Tyler spun toward the noise, adrenaline spiking. The figure had stepped fully into the alley, no longer content to hide. The man wore dark clothing that merged with the shadows, but Tyler could see the rigid posture, the controlled stride. A hood concealed part of his face, but there was no mistaking the cold focus behind his movements. This wasn't a man caught by surprise. This was someone in complete command. Robert Cavanaugh. He was exactly as the photo had shown, just older, more worn by obsession, more sharpened by years spent operating beyond the law. His eyes flicked from Tyler to the truck, and then to the partially exposed bundle on the ground, as if verifying each piece of the scene as expected. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't alarmed. He was checking his work. Tyler took a step back, but Cavanaugh lifted a gloved hand slightly, just enough of a gesture to freeze Tyler mid-movement. There was something terrifying in his composure. A man who did not fear consequences had a different look in his eyes. His were purely intent, as if he were standing in a laboratory rather than a filthy alley, as if Tyler were a subject rather than another living person. A sudden shout cut through the tense silence. "Police!" Dropped to the ground. Kavanaugh moved instantly, faster than Tyler could process. He seized the bundle with surprising strength and flung it toward Tyler, forcing him to stumble as he tried to avoid it. The distraction lasted only a heartbeat, but it was long enough. The killer darted toward the far end of the alley where the fence sagged inward, slipping through a narrow gap that looked too tight for a full-grown man. But he slid through it with expert precision, like a shadow squeezing through a crease in reality. Officers swarmed the alley seconds later, weapons drawn, voices commanding orders that no longer mattered. Tyler pressed against the truck, heart pounding, chest heaving. His attempt to shout a warning had caught in his throat as everything happened too fast to control. An officer rushed past him, shouting into a radio as he tried to pursue the escape route, but the fence led into a maze of adjacent lots crammed with obstacles. The killer had chosen his exit well. Detective Harris appeared, scanning the chaos, and his expression twisted with frustration as he realized their suspect had slipped away. But his focus shifted to Tyler, ensuring there were no injuries, asking if Kavanaugh had said anything. Tyler could only shake his head. The killer hadn't needed words to communicate. His silence had been loud enough. As police fanned out to search nearby blocks, Tyler stood silently near the truck, hands clenching and unclenching as he tried to shake the tremor from his fingers. The bundle lay where it had landed. An officer was already photographing it and marking it for evidence recovery. Tyler couldn't look at it anymore. When the alley was finally cleared enough for him to step away from the truck, Detective Harris walked beside him. The detective's frustration had faded into a more solemn expression. "He knows who you are," Harris said quietly. "He's watching every move we make, and he's 2 steps ahead." Tyler nodded numbly. That much had been clear from the moment Kavanaugh emerged from the shadows. It wasn't just about hiding bodies. It was about finishing something that had begun long before Tyler ever drove a garbage truck. Something tied not just to murder, but to erasure. Erasing evidence, erasing identities, erasing an entire history of what happened at that factory before the fire. Back at the station, they reviewed the footage from the hidden camera. Every second of the encounter had been captured. Kavanaugh's face wasn't entirely visible, but his movements, his stature, the way he handled the packaging with professional familiarity, it all confirmed the theory of his involvement. To Tyler's horror, the video also captured a chilling detail. Before the officers burst in, Kavanaugh had glanced briefly into the camera's direction. He had seen it. He had looked directly into Tyler's lens, eyes steady and intelligent, registering the deception without panic. He had walked into a trap and then walked right out again. That meant he was aware the police were no longer stumbling blindly. He knew the investigation had evolved into a hunt, but that did not stop him. If anything, it empowered him to escalate. The forensic team examined the new bundle at the lab. Tyler wasn't present, but Harris relayed the immediate findings later that day. Another former factory worker, another number burned into the skin, another piece of the buried puzzle. But this time, something else, something different. Inside the wrappings, along with the body, they found a small metal card, a tag, corroded but still legible under the harsh lab lights. It bore a number matching the branding, followed by a name. A real name. Not a case number or missing person file. A name that connected to grievance records from the time before the fire. A name that had been reportedly filed under injury settlement but whose family had claimed to have never received any closure. Kavanaugh wasn't simply discarding bodies anymore. He was leaving breadcrumbs. Why? To force truth into the open, to torment the living, to finish what his employers had begun. Tyler didn't know, but he knew the stakes had risen, higher than before, higher than any of them had prepared for. The sun slipped beyond the horizon again, and the city fell into the restless quiet of night. Tyler found himself unable to sit still. Fear had not diminished. It had evolved into a charged anticipation, a knowledge that the killer wasn't done, that he had slipped away only to strike again. And Tyler, unwittingly or not, had become part of the narrative Kavanaugh was building. He drove toward the industrial district once more, not knowing why he returned, only that something compelled him. The factory rose before him like a monument to all that had gone wrong in the city, a gateway into the past no one wanted to acknowledge. Wind howled through shattered windows and stirred debris across the empty loading dock. Tyler stared at the looming structure, its forgotten corridors and ruined machinery. Somewhere inside, answers waited to be uncovered. And somewhere inside, Kavanaugh moved with certainty. Suddenly, headlights swept across the pavement behind him. He tensed immediately, dread seizing him as the car slowed to a stop. But when the door opened, it was Detective Harris emerging from the vehicle. The man stepped out with weariness in his shoulders, but determination etched firmly into his expression. "The Federal Bureau has been notified," Harris said. "Whatever happened in there, it goes deeper than our city, and we're running out of time." Tyler stared at the detective, heart pounding, as the finality of that statement sank in. The killer wasn't just a murderer. He was a soldier still following orders no one else remembered, or dared to remember. Tyler had helped uncover the hidden dead. But now, someone needed to uncover the truth buried with them, and it would require stepping into the places the city had tried for years to forget. The places where the branded victims had spent their last days alive. The places where the experiment began, and where the nightmare had never truly ended. No one slept that night. Not Tyler. Not Detective Harris. Not the team now mobilizing with federal reinforcements to delve into the darkest corners of the city's forgotten past. Hours blurred into moments of tense preparation as they combed through every shred of information unearthed since that first black bag tore open in the teeth of a garbage truck. The remains, the coded brands, the records from the ruined factory, and the ghost-like presence of Robert Kavanaugh. Each piece of evidence twisted together into a picture more horrifying than any single crime could suggest. It wasn't just murder. It wasn't just cover-up. It was an entire system. A machine of cruelty dressed in industrial advancement and hidden behind legal jargon. And that machine had been interrupted once years ago. And now it was waking again. By dawn, Tyler found himself standing outside near his building, looking out at a city that suddenly felt smaller than it ever had before. The towers downtown gleamed in the early light, proud symbols of progress, prosperity, and everything his district had been denied. But beneath them, in the shadows of those glittering facades, lay a truth so deeply buried even the people tasked with uncovering it weren't sure how far down the rot went. He hadn't chosen this path, yet now he was inextricably attached to it. He could no more ignore what he'd learned than he could erase the memory of that first dead hand. He arrived at the station still tired but more alert than he had been in days. The briefing room was filled to capacity. Uniforms, suits, federal agents with clipped voices and inscrutable expressions. They stood before projected maps of the industrial area and the ravaged factory grounds, dissecting every scrap of historical documentation. Men and women whose backgrounds spanned intelligence, forensics, and countercrime units studied files like they were looking at a battlefield long forgotten. Because, in a way, they were. Detective Harris addressed everyone with a grave voice that left no illusions. This wasn't a simple police matter anymore. This was uncovering crimes that had been sanctioned, funded, and concealed by people who once wielded immense influence. The fire that destroyed the plant had been ruled accidental, but new evidence suggested it had been deliberate. A purge, a cleansing, a way to eliminate witnesses and halt further inquiry into what had taken place in the restricted sectors of that sprawling industrial complex. And Robert Kavanaugh. He hadn't been a rogue actor. He'd been part of it, one of the last remaining stewards of those secrets. The bodies he disposed of weren't chosen randomly. Each victim had been involved in some capacity with the underground operations at the plant. Some had guarded the labs. Others had worked hands-on with the materials. Some had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But all of them had something in common. They had lived to see the beginning of something so monstrous that those behind it believed death easier than letting them speak. Tyler listened as they laid out a plan. The factory, despite its state of decay, would be searched fully. Not the cursory documentation they'd done in the past, dismissing eerie claims as rumor. Real investigation. Every locked door would be opened, every sealed vault breached, every sublevel diagram traced to its real-world counterpart. The truth, finally, would be forced to the surface. It was also clear the operation would be dangerous. Federal agents would take point, but the local department's familiarity with the grounds was critical. And, in a twist Tyler almost couldn't process, his involvement was not optional. Because regardless of all the power and technology arrayed in that room, no one knew the terrain around that factory like the one man who had spent years traveling its perimeter, day after day, collecting the things the city threw away. He was the only one who had touched the evidence before it was even considered evidence. The only one Kavanaugh had shown himself to directly. More than that, Tyler represented the breach in secrecy. He was the reason the truth was stirring. And that placed him at the center of both the danger and the resolution. Fear crawled through him like a living thing. He tried to quiet it by reminding himself that running was no longer an option. Innocent people had suffered too long. Their voices had been stripped away, their bodies mutilated into anonymity, their memories buried under rubble. If he didn't step forward now, everything he had risked would be meaningless, and Kavanaugh would continue until no trace of the past remained at all. The convoy of armored vehicles approached the factory at mid-morning. The structure loomed like a giant skeleton against a washed-out sky, its charred walls towering with an unnatural presence. Police tape fluttered uselessly from old barricades as though protesting their irrelevance. Tyler stood among the officers as they prepared to enter, but he couldn't shake the sensation that the building itself was aware of them. Watching. Waiting. They breached the front entrance first, falling into methodical patterns as they fanned through the upper levels. The first floors revealed what was expected. Collapsed ceilings, dust-covered assembly lines, scorched offices filled with rusting equipment. But, as they descended deeper into the plant's guts, something shifted. The air grew colder, the walls cleaner. There were fresh lights, minimal but functional, wired in ways that suggested someone had been coming and going recently. From time to time, Tyler caught glimpses of metal doors reinforced far beyond what a standard industrial operation would require. The team breached one such door with a heavy hydraulic ram. Behind it lay a corridor that looked as if the fire had never touched it. Sterile white walls, floors with grids for draining fluids, rows of vacant cages and metallic platforms fixed with belts and restraints that still shone with polished clarity. A faint chemical odor lingered in the air, one Tyler couldn't identify but instantly felt uneasy inhaling. One of the agents muttered something under his breath, something sharp and full of disbelief. They moved deeper. A set of laboratories, equipment tagged with cryptic codes, security stations that still powered on under the flick of a switch, storage lockers packed with vials now covered in a thin layer of dust. It was all too intact, too preserved. One room stood out from the rest, its door marked with a blank metal square where a sign should have been. The lock resisted for a moment before surrendering with a heavy click. Inside, the temperature plunged dramatically. The light flickered as though resentful of revealing what lay within. Rows of metal slabs lined the walls, each outfitted with adjustable restraints. The branding tools. The source of those symbols. Scorched blocks arranged in sets, each matching the patterns they had seen burned into the victim's skin. Nearby, walls of irregular scorch marks suggested violent force had been applied repeatedly. Long grooves dragged across the floor hinted at struggles. Fingernail scrapes marred the lower corners of the walls in desperate lines. Tyler felt sick. These weren't just clues, they were relics of horror. A low hum caught his attention next. Detective Harris stiffened. The far side of the room, partly submerged beneath fencing and debris, concealed a service door. Unlike everything else, it showed signs of recent use. Scratches on the steel, dirt worn by boots. It led down, and they followed. The stairs spiraled into a subterranean chamber where the fire hadn't reached. The heat damage above had been a mask for the truth below, and that truth was a private cavern of experiments. Containers housing remains, some skeletal, some disturbingly preserved. Files scattered across workstations detailing genetic trials, chemical exposure tests, neurological implants, all performed on unknown human beings. Then they found the vault. Police approached it with extreme caution. The lock was a complex mechanical system coupled with digital controls, technology that shouldn't still be functioning after the fire. Yet the keypad blinked a steady green light. Someone had been maintaining it. Recent footprints in the dust confirmed what everyone feared but expected. Kavanaugh had been here. Recently. A federal technician cracked the digital interface while officers prepared to fire explosive charges in case of trap or reinforced closure. When the vault finally yielded, it exhaled cold air thick with the smell of antiseptic and age. Shelves lined the walls, each carrying dozens of sealed glass canisters containing ashes and bone fragments. Tags accompanied each container. Names, numbers, dates. The identities of the forgotten. Tyler stared, breath stolen from his lungs, heart twisting painfully. The victims he found in his truck were just the ones Kavanaugh hadn't finished hiding yet. The rest were cataloged and stored, human life reduced to inventory. Harris's voice broke the shocked silence, hoarse with emotion. "We have our case," he said. No one disagreed. There could be no more denial. The evidence was incontrovertible. The victims were here. The method was clear. The perpetrators, at least those still alive, would be named, and justice, however late, would begin. But even as officers photographed, documented, packaged, and seized every scrap of horror from that vault, Tyler felt something unresolved. Kavanaugh wasn't among the remains. He wasn't in handcuffs. He wasn't cornered. He was still out there, free, and now more aware than ever that his past had been exposed to daylight. When the convoy returned above ground, escorted by a media frenzy gathering like vultures beyond the barricades, the city was no longer blind. News cameras captured the ruined factory behind armed personnel. Journalists shouted questions. Crowds pressed forward wanting answers, outrage lighting their eyes. Families of the missing regained hope of closure. Investigations into old cover-ups surged. Scandals tore into the corridors of power where silence had once been bought. Names shielded for years were suddenly dragged into the spotlight. Arrests followed swiftly, first among lower-ranking participants, then among corporate figures and officials who had signed off on anything that made money without guilt. The victims were finally recognized, not as trash, not as failed experiments, but as human beings whose suffering deserved acknowledgement. At a public memorial 1 week later, Tyler stood among those who gathered to mourn the dead properly for the first time. Photographs of the victims lined the walls. Flowers covered the ground in a sea of soft color. Candles flickered against a backdrop of silence heavy with collective grief. Tyler felt their gratitude, though none of them knew his name. They didn't need to. It wasn't about him, it was about them. People whose stories should never have been discarded in the first place. But even as he felt some measure of peace, Tyler could not ignore the shadow that lingered behind his thoughts. In the crowd, he scanned for faces that didn't belong. He searched for eyes that watched too intently. He knew Kavanaugh wasn't finished. The man had lived too long in the protection of darkness to crumble under a single failed operation. He had escaped once. He could do it again. And he would not forgive what had been taken from him, not until he completed whatever twisted mission still guided him. After the memorial, Tyler walked the route back to his truck. The vehicle waited at the curb, clean and ready, no longer held as evidence. His leave had ended. Work was calling again. The city still produced its refuse, still hid its sins in bags and bins, still counted on people like Tyler to carry away what no one else wanted to confront. He climbed into the cab and rested his hands on the wheel. For the first time since the nightmare began, the familiar vibration of the engine starting felt grounding. It reminded him of who he was before everything changed, and who he had become because of it. He drove slowly into the waking streets, the morning light filtering through the windshield, as if trying to reassure him that life went on. Buildings glowed with fresh sunlight. People stepped out of houses and stores unaware of the shadows that had receded only slightly from beneath their feet. As he approached the industrial district, Tyler kept his eyes open. Somewhere out there, a man who believed himself a guardian of a deadly truth was still watching, still waiting, still planning. But Tyler was watching now too, and he would notice what others overlooked. The city had been built on the belief that trash vanished when thrown away, but nothing ever truly disappears. Everything leaves a trace, even secrets, especially secrets. Tyler Johnson would not let them be buried ever again. If this story shocked you as much as it shocked Tyler, don't leave now. Hit subscribe so you never miss what comes next, because this case is far from over. Tap. Like, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and share this video with someone who loves mysteries as much as you do. And whatever you do, don't go far. Our next video dives even deeper into the darkness he uncovered.